Okay, welcome everyone. I think this is the second event of 2024. We recently had an in-person event with Clem Ciceron on Chedi Jagan. So it naturally follows that we wanted to do something as well on Forbes Burnham. But I just wanted to start off by saying that this event is being recorded. If you don't want to appear on screen, then please just switch your videos off. But before we go on, there's always the Guyana Speaks jingle. So let's see if, I don't know, it might not be working.
Listen to Guyana's heart. You can hear it.
Oops, sorry. I just was trying to let somebody in.
Listen to Guyana's heart. You can hear it when we speak. It's the sound of six people from the land of the free. Even when we're miles apart, we are joined by the sea. Discover beauty in our culture as we share our history. Guyana speaks true, all are we. Guyana, we love this country. Welcome to Guyana Speaks. Welcome to Guyana Speaks.
Great, thank you. So obviously, as you know, today we're doing a talk on Forbes Burnham, the life and times of the Comrade Leader. We've had well over 130 people sign up today, which is a lot more than usual. So it's just to say that there will be people still joining as we go along. And also, because of the volume of people, if I go to the housekeeping, you'll see that the main criteria is to keep your audio on mute. And unfortunately, if we have any noise interference, then we will have to remove whoever it is making the noise into the waiting room. The other thing that I would ask is that you make sure your name, as it appears on the screen, matches the name that you registered with. So if I can't see, if it says iPad or Galaxy S7 or anything like that, we may move you into the waiting room unless we already know who you are. The other thing is to say that on this event, we normally actually have events where we're free all to speak and direct questions directly to the presenter. But because we've got such a large number of people again today, I think the best thing for us to do is if you have any questions or comments as you go along, please put them in the chat, and then I can mediate those questions and relay them back to Linden. For those of you who don't know, obviously I'm Juanita Cox. I'm the moderator of Guyana Speaks. And at this beginning stage, I just want to also mention the forthcoming events that we have. So next month, on the 28th of April, on Sunday, we will be having Baitaram Ramharak talking about J.B. Singh. And as many of you will know, Baitaram is a very accomplished scholar and author of several books. But I'm giving a particular shout out to him today because he's the second prize winner of the 2023 Guyana Prize for Nonfiction, with his book, A Powerful Indian Voice, that is about Alice Bhagwandai Singh. And he's actually done a talk for Guyana Speaks in the past when he was preparing for this book. So hence we won't be doing another event on that, but I just wanted to mention it. The other thing to say is that in May, rather than having a Guyana Speaks event, Guyana Speaks is partnering with Guzda, and we're going to be assisting with the Guyana Folk Festival. So just to say, for those of you who haven't attended before, the Guyana Folks Festival takes place at the Oasis Academy, Shirley Park in Croydon. It's pretty much an all-day event. Well, it starts at 1 o'clock, finishes at 9. It's all about entertainment and food and music, but we will be having a lot of people coming onto the stage, people like the poet Maggie Harris. We're also privileged to have Gavin of Creole Rock coming as well. So that should be a really fun event. And then we're back to a Guyana Speaks only event on the 29th of June when we have our annual Stabroek Stalls, which takes place at Draper Hall in Elephant and Castle. It's a much more kind of folksy type of event where we have kwekwe dancing, folk singing, as well as all the stalls selling books, arts and crafts, you know, El Dorado, Guyanese food, that kind of thing. So for those of you who are new to Guyana Speaks has been going since January 2017. We do one event a month on the whole, although sometimes we do two, but if time allows. But just to say that if you want to be informed of future upcoming events, you can either follow us on Facebook. You just need to look up Guyana Speaks. Follow us on Twitter. My Twitter handle is @JCWestmas. WESTMAAS, or you can email us at guyanaspeaks@gmail.com and ask to be put on the circular. So then, yes, so all of that out of the way now, and I'm really delighted today to introduce you to this month's speaker. Emeritus Professor Linden Lewis, who is the co-author of several books, including Caribbean Masala, Indian Identity in Guyana and Trinidad. He also edited collections Color, Hair and Bone, Race in the 21st Century, The Culture of Gender and Sexuality in the Caribbean, and Caribbean Sovereignty, Development and Democracy in an Age of Globalization. So, and his latest book, Forbes Burnham, The Life and Times of the Comrade Leader, of course, forms the basis of today's talk. Now, obviously, there's a big audience here, and we're all putting our hands together for you, Linden, but I'm the only one you can hear, so I'll do the clapping on their behalf. And I'd like to pass over to you. I'm just going to try and spotlight you so that everyone sees you, and go to this page so you can get started.
Okay. Well, good afternoon to everyone. Well, good morning to some and good afternoon to others. Thanks, Rod Westmas and Juanita Cox for inviting me to do this. And I'd also like to thank Simon Lister. I don't know if he's here for the chance to encounter. He is?
Yes, he is. Yeah, I saw him come online.
Oh, well, thanks, Simon, for the chance encounter with Rod, which makes this whole thing possible. So Forbes Burnham, The Rise and Fall of the Comrade Leader. And I want to start with an overview of British Guyana. So this is 2. Yeah. British Guyana, now Guyana, is located on the northern coast of South America. The country derives the name from the Arawak Guyana language, which means land of many waters, and Georgetown is its capital. 3, Forbes Burnham was Premier, Prime Minister, and the first Executive President of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. He held political office from 1964 to 1985. By the time of his death, he had guided British Guyana to independence in 1966, leading to the rechristening of the country from Guyana Guiana to Guyana Guyana, and had presided over the Cooperative Republic from 1970 to 1985. The political trajectory of Forbes Burnham, his charisma, the domination of the party he led, People's National Congress, and his nationalist and Pan-Africanist philosophy represent a unique perspective from which to understand Guyanese colonial and post-colonial history. A history which is marked by British colonial domination that presided over slavery and indenture. This imperial history, combined and amplified in conjunction with the United States Cold War interests in thwarting any communist design from emerging in Latin America. It is virtually impossible to understand the history of modern Guyana without understanding the role played by Forbes Burnham in shaping its development, beginning with beginning with his contribution to colonial resistance to the consolidation of independence. Forbes Burnham had been a formidable Caribbean leader. He was in the forefront of significant regional and political initiatives. We should not overlook the fact, however, that a biography of Forbes Burnham is also a textbook example of what happens when charisma is not enough. Indeed, when charisma becomes routinized and gives way to practices of authoritarianism and oppression. It is a study of both the appeal and disdain of the authoritarian leader. Forbes Burnham maintained himself in power through an elaborate system of vote rigging nationally and internationally via overseas proxy voting. The rationale behind the biography is therefore to attempt to understand the complexity of this political leader and the way that charisma and authoritarianism, as well as popular nationalism, intersect. It is also an attempt to discern the ways in which a society creates the space in which an authoritarian personality emerges, and how such dictatorial tendencies are combined with promoting a sense of national pride, leadership in the arts, and international and regional progressive politics. The portrait is also an analysis of the nature of post-colonial leadership and its pitfalls. I just want to give you a sense of his character, something I call the genealogy of being. The presentation has as its focus the genealogy of being. It is an attempt to understand the nature and the essence of a man who emerged from humble beginnings to lead a poor South American and Caribbean country. In a process, in this process, he had to overcome the internalized logic of the dominant colonial education and socialization of the day to begin to imagine himself as the leader of an independent country in the family of nations. In short, the intent here is to examine some of the circumstances that shaped Forbes Burnham's sense of being by tracing the social and political philosophy of the man through his history and practice. At various moments of this history, his leadership was visionary, contradictory, controversial, and ultimately flawed. Through all of the colonial and post-colonial struggles, Burnham occupied an important space and role on the regional and international stage. The genealogy of being then refers to an attempt to understand the construction of layers that shape the core sense of who he was, his worldview, and how others came to view the man who left an indelible mark on the history of his native Guyana. Linden Forbes Sampson Burnham was born on February 20th, 1923, in Kitty, a working class area of Greater Georgetown, Guyana. Kitty is one of the most densely populated districts today. It is here in the working class area that Forbes Burnham's awareness of the status of the people who lived around him was ignited. The philosophy of his being is formed in the context, in the awareness of the lived experience of the people among whom he coexisted. Based on some of Forbes Burnham's reflections about his upbringing, it is this thinking, this sense of his own subjectivity, and the consciousness of his social and historical condition that remained with him throughout his life. In 1981, then, President Burnham designated a plot of land formerly owned by his family at the corner of Pike Street and Stanley Place in Kitty as a playground for the children in that area. Forbes Burnham attended Central High School and later Queen's College, the premier boys' school in British Guiana at the time. It was there that he won an internal scholarship which provided the financial resources that were needed to facilitate successful completion of the education at this level. In 1942, Burnham won the prestigious Guyana Scholarship Award and awarded annually to the brightest high school student in the country. The award provided the recipient with a scholarship to pursue a program of study leading to a degree at a British university. His departure to study in England had to be delayed owing to the Second World War. In 1947, at the end of the war, he set off for England, where he studied law at the University of London, finishing the program of study with honors, and was later called to the bar at Gray's Inn in 1948. In 1949, Burnham returned to Guyana, and after a brief alliance with the League of Colored People, joined the Political Affairs Committee, led by Dr. Cheddi Jagan, which would be number 4. The PAC was the forerunner. The PAC was the forerunner to the People's Progressive Party. In effect, the Political Affairs Committee became a political vehicle beyond the labor movement of the 1930s, through which the colonial conditions of British Guyana were contested, which stirred the emergence of radical politics and heightened the national consciousness around the issues of political rights. The PPP was established in 1950. It mounted the first nationalist challenge to colonial rule and won the 1953 elections handily. Number 5. Many observers have noted that the People's Progressive Party of 1950 was the greatest hope of the future of British Guyana. It was viewed as a multi-ethnic and unified political party, which embraced the aspirations of the people of Guyana to be free of colonial bondage and to encompass a notion of self-determination. Though on the surface, this may have appeared a valid observation, if one dug deeper, one would find that the new party was somewhat less than unified and had different interpretations of the nationalist project. The PPP embodied people of Indian and African descent, two groups which had long been subject to colonially manipulated dissension, calculated to frustrate attempts at solidarity. It also contained a faction of Marxists, particularly Cheddi Jagan and his wife Janet, along with others such as Brindley Ben, Rory Westmus, Martin Carter, and Lionel Jeffrey. Simultaneously, the party also included moderately left and left of center persons such as Forbes Burnham, in addition to Muslims and Hindus. Number 6. It was therefore an amalgam of disparate individuals attempting to assemble under one tent. Some saw the early PPP more as a coalition than a wholly unified party. However, by 1955, the PPP had split into two factions led by Cheddi Jagan and Forbes Burnham, respectively. In summary, however, the upshot of the disagreement between the two political leaders arose after the 1953 elections. In this period, Burnham began to argue that as chairman of the party, he was also leader of the party. This interpretation was contrary to the constitution of the party. Burnham objected and then drew a line in the sand, arguing for leadership or nothing. He later established a more center-left branch of the PPP in 1956. I want to place this now in the context of the Cold War. A full appreciation of what happened in the colonial period of British Guyana necessitates some reflection on the global and political context of the day. The year 1947 marked the beginning of the Cold War, an ideological struggle between Eastern and Western superpowers for global supremacy and for the hearts and minds of people. Though Guyana was not geographically part of this ideological divide, it nevertheless became ensnared in the rhetoric and schisms of this period. Contributing to the entanglement of Guyana in this ideological struggle was the declaration of the PPP's leader, Cheddi Jagan, and his wife, Janet, that they were Marxists. There were other members of the party who had also declared themselves Marxists or Marxist-Leninists and had expressed empathy and support for the Soviet Union's socialist development and leadership. Such a political alignment on the part of an emergent political party fighting against British imperial control and in the ambit of the American articulation of manifest destiny, as well as the United States, United Kingdom Atlantic Charter, was destined to attract the attention of both the American and the British. The position was especially noteworthy insofar as there was no such radical political philosophical embrace by any other political leaders in the Caribbean whose territories had acquired internal self-government status. In addition to the Cold War tension of the period, Guyana's nationalist struggles were also emerging at the beginning of the Korean War in the glare of Joseph McCarthy's witch hunts and the start of the Cuban Revolution in 1953, which culminated in 1959 with the ouster of Batista by Fidel Castro. It would be reasonable to argue that there was nothing particularly radical about Jagan's Marxist politics beyond the language of progressivism and its opposition to imperialism. However, it would not have taken much in the heyday of anti-colonial fervor, of rising nationalist sentiments, and a critique of white settler supremacy to convey to the colonial authorities some ominous portent. The upshot of all this was that the British suspended the Constitution and overthrew the government a mere 133 days after the PPP had assumed office. Burnham and Jagan split in 1955, each retaining the PPP name, so there was a Burnhamite and a Jaganite faction of the PPP. Elections were held in 1957, and Cheddi Jagan and the PPP won once again. In 1961, despite all efforts against a repeat of the PPP victory, Cheddi Jagan won the election. Once again, Cheddi Jagan had won a convincing majority despite all the challenges and obstacles placed in his way. What eventually became a major issue was the problem of conducting the elections on the first past the post system in Guyana. Forbes Burnham then entered into a coalition with Peter de Gar, which would be number 7, to unseat Cheddi Jagan's PPP. Burnham's centrist political position was at least a contingency strategy of forging the possibility of a coalition with the united force led by Peter de Gar, a Guyanese of Portuguese descent and an astute businessman. Burnham knew that on its own, the PNC could not win an election given the numerical strength of the Indian community and their solid support of Jagan. Peter de Gar was a virulent anti-communist. He saw Cheddi Jagan and the PPP as ruinous to the development of British Guyana and, of course, to his own capitalist interests. The problem here for Burnham was that in the context of a racially stratified country, he could not rely entirely on the vote of people of African descent. Much of the drive behind the opposition to Cheddi Jagan emanated from John F. Kennedy. Very early on, Kennedy clearly communicated to British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan of Britain that the United States could not tolerate another Fidel Castro, number 8, in the Western Hemisphere, and therefore was opposed to Cheddi Jagan in leading British Guyana to independence. Kennedy, along with other members of his cabinet, felt that once free of the yoke of colonial bondage, Cheddi Jagan would show his true communist colors. In a concluding remark in his book, Stephen Rabe argued, and I quote, "In their war against the Jagans, 3 presidential administrations sacrificed the ideals and values they claimed to uphold in the battle against international communism," unquote. William is quite charitable in the foregoing observation. One is not so sure that these various administrations regretted sacrificing their principles. To assume that they did is to believe that democracy is truly compatible with capitalism, and that the desire to exercise power and influence globally is in some way hamstrung by the ideals of democracy and legitimacy. Such ideals are often the casualty of more pressing priorities of ensuring the reproduction of international capital and specific geopolitical national security interests. This was precisely the thinking of England in India, Kenya, and throughout the colonial empire. The US did not allow democracy to prevent them invading Haiti in 1914 and again in 1915. The Woodrow Wilson administration overthrew the elected governments in the Dominican Republic, in Chile, and in Guatemala. The United States, under the code name Operation Ajax, colluded with the United Kingdom to overthrow the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran. As Peter Beinart argued, quote, historically, American meddling in the elections of foreign countries has done far more to harm democracy than to promote it, unquote. My point is that by the time we got to the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Guyana, the Anglo-American alliance had significant practice in this regard. In summary then, all of the elections in Guyana from 1968 to 1985 were tainted by the practice of electoral manipulation, practice of electoral manipulation. In the process, Forbes Burnham, through a number of political maneuvers, consolidated his rule and solidified the party's control over the National Assembly. I want to make a few remarks about the state because I think it is important to understand how this works with leadership. The social relationship that is the state is materially expressed in the forms that many have come to understand, namely as the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. However, the state is not reducible to those three branches, but expands to include the military, the constabulary, all paramilitary units, the school system, the church, and other social and civic organizations. It is in this context that one should examine the political practice of Forbes Burnham. 9. It is in this sense also that one could begin to understand his consolidation of power. In other words, the capitalist state, or more specifically, the peripheral capitalist state in the Caribbean in general, is conducive to producing a particular type of authoritarian leadership and personality demonstrated by Forbes Burnham. The type of personality of the political leader varies from country to country. Put differently, most Caribbean leaders display some measure of authoritarianism, whether it occurs in the way they handle criticism inside their own political party or outside in the wider society. Authoritarianism is also evident in political leaders' approaches to decision-making and to their expectation of loyalty and deference. In the case of the rule of Forbes Burnham, some of these authoritarian tendencies were perhaps more pronounced than was the case with other Caribbean leaders. The above framework is also useful in understanding how control over the various apparatuses and levers of the state by political leaders is conducive to the type of abuse that permits the manipulation of an electoral machinery to remain in power, whether in terms of gerrymandering or political districts, facilitating voter fraud, voter suppression, or orchestrating a non-transparent system of vote counting. Forbes Burnham and his party operatives understood these technologies of manipulation and obfuscation in the drama of politics in Guyana. Burnham, like other Caribbean leaders, understood how to manipulate the ideological apparatuses of the state to his advantage. The control over the apparatuses of the state in Guyana placed him in a different category of authoritarian leadership from most of the other Caribbean leaders. It is nevertheless precisely the constitutively authoritarian character of the state that permits these types of development in the cut and thrust of the arena of politics. In 1974, the Forbes Burnham administration entered a new political phase. In a social party congress to mark the 10th anniversary of the People's National Congress in government, Prime Minister Forbes Burnham introduced and articulated his philosophy of party paramountcy. The new political orientation was announced and subsequently referred to in the Sophia Declaration. Sophia, of course, in Guyana, Sophia in any other part of the world. The presumed goal of the new direction was to mobilize the nation in all its dimensions, not merely at election time. It was on this occasion that Burnham declared that the party should assume unapologetically the paramountcy over the government, quote, which is merely one of the executive arms. The PNC was no ordinary political organization. It became the vanguard. As Ben-Ghiat noted in her book on strongmen, quote, strongmen don't differentiate between personal and national interests. She notes, unquote, she notes further, quote, the idea of the strongman who brings his nation to greatness is a foundation of authoritarian history, unquote. The political leader projects such an attribute while the electorate is complicit in its validation, often unmindful of how appeals to national sentiment could obfuscate authoritarian practices and policies. Indeed, given Forbes Burnham's stewardship of the country from British Guiana to the independent nation of Guyana and subsequently moving to a republic, it is understandable that many would view him as leaving a legacy of national pride among the demos. One should be mindful, however, of the extent to which these nationalist sentiments intersected with the interests of the political leadership in Guyana. We should not be unmindful of where the nationalist philosophy blended seamlessly with the advocacy of the cooperative project, which in turn should not be divorced from the political philosophy of party paramountcy. In practice, rather than merely enhancing a sense of pride of nationhood, nationalism could very well be the handmaiden of the status policies. The erosion of the practice of democracy in Guyana under the aegis of nationalism and even regionalism facilitated authoritarian policies with an appropriate cover. Burnham presided over a significant increase in military expenditure. The GDF was added to the Guyana National Service in 1974. Apart from defense, the functions of the latter body came to include political education, hinterland development, and agriculture and industrial production. Added to this development was the People's Militia. Burnham institutionalized and formalized direct executive control over the military. Indeed, his control of the military was on full display in 1973 when members of the Guyana Defense Force were put in charge of transporting the ballot boxes in Jonestown for counting, an act which was part of the repertoire of an autocrat who was not only bent on maintaining power, but on consolidating his rule. Ben-Ghiat again reminded us recently that, quote, elections had long been a mark of an open society and their adherence a criterion of autocracy, but new authoritarians use elections to keep themselves in office, deploying anti-democratic tactics like fraud or voter suppression to get the results they needed, unquote. To implement further constitutional control, the Burnham administration eliminated the plebiscite and two-thirds majority in parliament, which were needed to make constitutional changes. The Burnham administration proposed a referendum that would obviate the plebiscite as well as the two-thirds majority vote. This was the infamous referendum to end all referenda. Given the established practice of vote rigging, it was no surprise that the referendum passed, taking party paramountcy to even higher levels. Once the plebiscite was eliminated, given the PNC's two-thirds majority in parliament, the government seized the opportunity to introduce a new constitution in 1980. In addition, Forbes Burnham moved quickly to eliminate the British Privy Council as the final court of appeal. The president also exercised control over the civil service in terms of appointing members of the Constitutional Commission, the Public and Teaching Services, the police, the Director of Public Prosecution, Auditor General, Solicitor General, and permanent secretaries. Finally, one of the most revealing acts of the exercise of power has to do with the provision of presidential immunities. In effect, President Linden Forbes Burnham, in the provision of presidential immunities, had placed himself above the law and was therefore accountable to no one. This provision was at the very apex of the modalities of control and power exercised by the head of state in Guyana. As Anne Applebaum noted in another context, quote, the point of all these changes was not to make government run better. The point was to make government more partisan, the courts more pliable, and more beholden to the party, unquote. And we can add, and more specifically, under the guidance of Forbes Burnham himself. I want to touch now on the Jonestown massacre, which would be 10. Guyana experienced international notoriety on November 18th, 1978, when the Reverend James Warren Jones of the United States led 918 of his People's Temple followers, most of whom were Americans, to commit suicide at Jonestown in Port Kaitumo in the northwest of Guyana. Many of the followers either voluntarily or involuntarily drank a lethal combination of Kool-Aid and cyanide. Those who were reluctant to follow through with the murder-suicide plan were shot. The scenario, White Nights rehearsals, was one that was often practiced at the direction of Jones, who feared that the United States was in danger of an impending nuclear conflagration. His other obsession revolved around his belief that the Central Intelligence Agency was determined to destroy him and his church. This massacre was significant at a number of levels, but in terms of the focus of this presentation, two concerns become pertinent. First, what connection, if any, existed between Jones, his religious sect, and the government of Guyana? Second, how did this religious group function for the most part under the radar of most of the Guyana public? Jones' interest in Guyana's cooperative agricultural program led him to apply to the Ministry of Agriculture and National Development for a plot of land. He was granted that lease of 3,000 acres of land in 1976. Given the vast amount of available uncultivated land in Guyana and the government's goal of hinterland development, the country was in fact an ideal location not only for Jones's goal of self-sufficiency, but also provided the isolation from a bustling urban Georgetown environment. What became evident about Jim Jones's People's Temple is that it enjoyed the full support and confidence of the Guyana government. According to the staff investigative group report to the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the US House of Representatives, the Jonestown affair pointed to the Guyana government's
Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I'm terribly sorry. I muted you by accident. Somebody else was unmuted and I muted you by accident. Bear with me. If you can unmute yourself, that would be really helpful.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Sorry, we missed about a minute of what you were saying.
I was simply talking about the way in which the U.S. government assessed and reported to the House of Representatives on what was happening in Guyana and the lax policy of vetting of Jim Jones Temple followers. After independence in 1966, Forbes Burnham moved fairly quickly in refocusing the country away from any colonial vestiges to the status of republic. On the 23rd of February 1970, Guyana became the first cooperative republic in the world and the first republic in the Commonwealth Caribbean. In addition, in an address to the People's National Congress, the 13th annual delegation of Congress, Forbes Burnham also noted, quote, "In becoming a republic, we removed the psychological ties with the British monarch, which in many cases have inhibited the thinking and colored the attitudes of several Guyanese," unquote. Very closely associated with the idea of cooperative republic was what became a People's National Congress mantra, namely the stated policy to feed, clothe, and house the nation by 1976. The notion was introduced in the context of the Second Development Plan of 1973. Unfortunately, history has not been kind to the Burnham administration's ability to deliver on the promise to feed, clothe, and house the Guyanese population. These programs were all spectacular failures. In short, the cooperative as a policy tool had in effect become an instrument of the state. And as C.Y. Thomas concluded, the cooperative sector of the cooperative republic has played quite a marginal role, unquote. An important adjunct to the economic strategy of the cooperative was the process of nationalization of foreign assets. The Demerara Bauxite Limited, a subsidiary of the Canadian Bauxite Transnational Alcan, was the first to be nationalized in 1971. Guyana Timbers was nationalized in 1972, and Reynolds in 1975. In addition, a number of industries were nationalized over the next 5 years, including Booker Brothers Company in 1976. While the Burnham administration was proceeding with the programs of nationalization, not everyone, even some in his inner circle, seemed convinced of the wisdom of his economic strategy. However, given Burnham's unquestioned authority, no one from his inner circle voiced any objection, at least not publicly. Some have argued that the nationalization projects failed because, among other things, they did not place people in technical positions by virtue of their expertise, but on the basis of their loyalty to the party. The Latin American Bureau report noted that not a single foreign company complained about the terms on which its business was acquired. Perhaps the transnational companies did not protest because of the bargains they had struck in the government. I want to touch briefly, and we could pick up on this later, on the Walter Rodney, on the death of Walter Rodney, the assassination of Walter Rodney. This would be 11. Thank you. By 1980, the political situation had reached boiling point. Economic crises continued to plague the political economy, and protests and demonstrations increased. The WPA was clearly beginning to mobilize support across various constituencies and had begun to be a thorn in the side of the Burnham administration. Walter Rodney's profile as a credible political figure had risen in stature. The government had to do something to disrupt the growing influence of this young multi-ethnic party, which had abandoned old-style racial mobilization and represented an alternative to both the PNC and the PPP. On June the 13th, 1980, Walter Rodney was killed as a result of an explosion from an electronic device contained in a brown paper bag, which exploded in his lap. Rodney was sitting in a parked Mazda Capilla car, driven by his brother Donald Rodney, in the area between John Street and Hatfield Street in Georgetown. At the time, he was believed to be testing a walkie-talkie, which his brother had obtained on his behalf from a retired Army Sergeant, Gregory Smith. Smith was an electronics expert in the Guyana Defense Force. Rodney's sudden and violent death as one of the most popular members of the WPA, originally an internationally renowned scholar, sent shockwaves throughout the Caribbean and the wider Guyanese diaspora. It was quickly labeled an assassination. The condemnation, all of which was directed at President Burnham and the PNC as being responsible for Dr. Rodney's death, came in from all parts of the world. To no one's surprise, Burnham denied all knowledge of the demise of Walter Rodney. He philosophized, quote, sad as I am at his inglorious end, I know that somewhere therein is bound to be a lesson for the misguided others, unquote. This comment was followed up subsequently by an ominous warning. Burnham said, quote, comrades, we are now in the Roman amphitheater. The lion and the gladiator cannot both survive. One must die, and we know that the People's National Congress will live, unquote. The commission report concluded, quote, we have no hesitation in holding that Gregory Smith was responsible for Dr. Walter Rodney's death on the 13th of June, 1980, and that in so doing, he was acting as an agent of the state, having been aided and abetted so to do by individuals holding positions of leadership in state agencies and committed to carrying out the wishes of the PNC administration. The Rodney Commission of Inquiry was more strident in its conclusion. Quote, we accept too that Gregory Smith was encouraged in providing that device by prominent members of the state agencies, unquote. The Rodney Commission report further concluded that there was sufficient evidence to implicate the government of Guyana to Gregory Smith's subsequent actions following Rodney's demise. There is little doubt that the assassination of Walter Rodney in June 1980 represented a blot on the Forbes Burnham image. I want to talk now about the ambivalence of his legacy. To commence an assessment of Forbes Burnham's legacy would require an observer to ask him or herself, how does history remember him? History, however, is always intertwined with memory, which in turn is subject to forgetting. Given the polarized nature of Guyanese political history, the question becomes, is it possible to examine Burnham's legacy in its entirety? Is it possible to examine Burnham's legacy in entirely value-neutral terms? The racial polarization that occupied such a prominent space in the history of the nationalist movement in Guyana almost assures us that not only the history of Forbes Burnham would be fashioned in the crucible of racial memory, but it would also be framed by the acts of forgetting. There is a type of forgetting whose purpose is to purge whatever is unsavory, unflattering, or unseemly about the subject of memory. Such purging represents an abuse of memory. Another type of forgetting is characterized by the sins of omission. Over time, the memory becomes so dwarfed by political animus that all contributions to the nation are erased in the fog of partisanship. Indeed, some of these responses fall into what the Joyce scholar John Ricard called nostalgia, or the misrepresentation or misrecollection of the past. One major characteristic of Forbes Burnham was his profound understanding of the realm of the political. He, perhaps better than anyone else at the time, understood the political scene, had a fundamental grip of his constituents, understood their fears and aspirations and how to tap into such feelings. Burnham could also read the other politicians. He knew their strengths, their weaknesses, and their failings. Beyond these matters, he also understood the colonial and imperial Anglo-American relationship. He knew what assurances they needed from him, and he pandered to them, but somewhat on his own terms. In assessing the legacy of Forbes Burnham, we should be reminded that while the individual cannot on his own change the objective conditions of history by design, an individual from time to time can exercise a powerful influence on the shape of the social formation. As Gregory Plekhanov reminded us, quote, history should be seen neither as the consequence of the actions of individuals from above or the movements from below. Excuse me. The relationship is a dialectical one. In short, whatever we conclude about the legacy of Burnham, Guyanese must ask themselves, to what extent did they contribute to this history? Who among the demos aided in the fomenting of racial antipathy? Who worked strenuously to undermine the government initiatives, even if they were in the best interests of the nation? Who aided and abetted political corruption? Who facilitated electoral rigging? Who participated in gerrymandering? Who, rather than staying and struggling for justice and change, fled to different shores? Who was the source of vicious rumors? Who was the who saw their primary function as that of snitching on political followers or opponents? Who aided in covering up crimes? George Lamin's reflection on Burnham's legacy and the following, said the following, quote, one of the legacies of Burnham's years was the extraordinary migration of the human resources of that country. It was one of the most damaging legacies of Burnham. It was a migration from horror, unquote. What is involved is an assessment of the political leader. What is involved in the political leader is a combination of the passion and conviction of the followers who believed that the charismatic leader is working selflessly on their behalf, and that their success is in fact linked to his success. So that to criticize anything about the leader is sacrosanct, blasphemous, and has to be dismissed without any deep consideration of thought or his claims of the righteousness of his appeal. The defense of these political positions is fierce and not open to reasoned argument. We really must talk about the afterlife of Forbes Burnham. Despite his death 39 years ago, there is an intensity of defense of his political leadership and policies, even in light of considerable evidence of his flaws. Moreover, there is a palpable fear of retribution from his most devoted disciples, which prevented many people from speaking to me. Or when they did, they asked not to be identified. I believe that Eric Hoffer summed up this situation brilliantly when he said, quote, the blindness of the fanatic is a source of strength. He sees no obstacles, but it is the cause of intellectual sterility and emotional monotony. And so the death of the Comrade Leader. Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham was not in robust health, even though he appeared indomitable. He was reportedly born with only one kidney. He had cirrhosis and was also diabetic. And as a first-rate political orator, he developed issues with his throat and vocal cords, which led to hoarseness from time to time. On Tuesday, August 6, 1985, President Forbes Burnham was admitted to the #1 operating theater at the Jonestown Hospital at around 7:15 a.m. for minor throat surgery, which was occasioned by his leukoplakia, a non-cancerous condition, which in some cases can become cancerous. By all accounts, the operation seemed to have gone smoothly. However, following the operation, his recovery seemed to be occurring slowly. This situation was exacerbated by difficulty he was experiencing breathing. Forbes Burnham then seemed to be in cardiac arrest and did not respond to treatment. He died at 10:45 a.m. on August 6, 1985. So ended the life of the longest living leader in the CARICOM area. President Forbes Burnham held office for 21 years. Like so many other politicians from the Caribbean, Forbes Burnham was not a perfect man. His imperfections, however, were magnified by the authoritarian nature of his leadership, the manner in which he secured power and reproduced himself in office. Though from time to time other Caribbean leaders have been accused of electoral manipulation or gerrymandering, Burnham's peccadillos were perhaps more egregious than most. This feature of his character accounts in large measure for the ambivalence of his legacy. Nevertheless, Burnham's personality was larger than life. He was respected around the Caribbean as a major political leader who was viewed in his party and beyond as a visionary and powerful leader. 39 years after his death, Burnham is remembered in Guyana and throughout the Caribbean as a formidable political leader and an ardent regionalist and supporter of the struggle of the global South. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Linden. A really powerful talk. First, I guess what I wanted to say is just really refreshing to listen to something that's very critical.
Anita, I think you're muted.
Am I muted? No, Rod can hear me.
No, you can't. You can.
Can you hear me, Nigel?
Yeah, we could hear you.
Yeah, yes.
Okay,
We
but
can
Linden,
hear
you
you.
can't hear me.
Anita, I'm not hearing you.
Okay, well, Rod, can you pick up for me then, seeing as Linden can't hear me? Just let him know that I'm hearing him, but if you can unmute Rod.
Yeah, I'm
Rod?
unmuted. Yeah, I'm here. Linden, can you hear us? No? Are you hearing me? Yeah?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm not sure what's up with Linden. Let's
Okay,
try.
I could hear you now.
You can hear
Okay,
us
lovely.
now. Okay,
Okay.
good. I don't know what happened there, but yeah, just to say thank you so much for your talk. It's refreshing to have a conversation about, or to hear about Forbes Burnham in a way that I can sense the kind of critical distance. I think a lot of the time when I've spoken, or I've been in spaces where I felt like, Forbes Burnham was the kind of elephant in the room that either people couldn't talk about, or that Forbes Burnham was such a polarizing figure that these conversations were never going to be able to happen. And I just wanted to ask you as a question, given that he is a polarizing figure, how did that fact influence or affect your research and your kind of assessment of his role in Guyana over time?
Well, I think to use a popular expression, I didn't have a dog in the fight. I was not PPP, I was not PNC, I wasn't WPA, I wasn't UF, I wasn't anything. I was just an observer from outside looking in and being familiar with the name of Forbes Burnham just about all my life. And I recognized that there were things that were positive and useful and progressive even, and that there were things that you just couldn't overlook. And one of the things that I couldn't understand, and you know, as time goes by, you begin to get a sense of what is going on, is that people who love him saw no problem with whatever he was doing. And we're familiar with that particular political behavior in the contemporary period. So, you know, this is the point I was trying to get across about the memory of who he is and what colors our memory of this particular figure. And so I think once you lined up alongside one of the political parties, there's a tendency to ignore the question of objectivity. And so you just stick within your own cocoon.
No, that was really interesting, and I think that was the thing that was most powerful for me, was when you were talking about this whole issue of history and memory, and actually that we needed to remember that this is a dialectical relationship. So I think when you said, you know, who aided up covering the crimes, you know, who fled the country, all that kind of thing, it really made me pause and think about, yeah, we're all culpable in one way or another. But I wondered if there's any questions in the chat. Just to say to people that obviously what we want to do is to put the questions in the chat, and then I can relay them. But while you're thinking about that, I just got a few more questions that if I can pose to you, more about you know, how you came to write the book, because I remember meeting you briefly maybe I don't know, 7 years or something ago, when you first in where were we?
New Orleans.
New Orleans,
yeah.
yeah, we were in New Orleans at an academic conference, and I heard you say, "Oh, I'm planning to write this book on Burnham." I thought, "Oh my gosh, he's a brave man." So I just wondered what inspired you to write the book, and how did that initial spark evolve into the finished work? Yeah.
Well, there are a couple of things. One is that I carry part of his name, and there are some people who never allowed me to forget that. Two, a good friend and colleague of mine, Anton Alahar, professor in Canada, retired professor in Canada, edited a book of Caribbean leadership, and the focus was on charisma. And I don't remember if he asked me or if I decided on it myself, but I wrote a chapter in the book on Caribbean charisma. And a late Guyanese colleague and friend of mine also, Horace Henriques, after he read it, he said to me, what are you going to do with this now? I mean, he said, you can't leave it like this. And so my intention was always to get back to doing this project. But a lot of things interceded, and so I got involved in a number of other projects. And so it took a longer time for me to get back to it. But it you know, again, it's just one of those things that you see one side of the spectrum and not the other side. And I wanted to try to do an analysis of this leadership that didn't veer to one side or the other, but tended to be as objective as possible.
Okay, yeah. So I can see people are saying that there's just too many questions to ask for them to type into the chat. So, but one person, Rohana, said, what influence did Papa Doc have on LFS, if any? She just says that that LFS was an admirer of Papa Doc.
I don't know if he was, but I wouldn't compare the two of them in that way. Papa Doc was really much more extreme, did a lot of things that I thought went off the rail. And I had been around for so much longer. You know, one of the things that only arrested my attention after I got involved in it is how young Burnham died. He was only 63, right? The other person who died very young was Tom Adams, who was 53. But I think that because he was around for such a long time, he was around in the imagination of people for such a long time, that we tend to believe that that he was much older. I am not sure that I would make the comparison with Papa Doc. I think that's pretty extreme, and I'm not sure that I would do that. And you know, the other thing is that Papa Doc also organized a way of passing on the leadership to his son, which Burnham didn't have any time to pass on to any of his daughters.
So I'm just wondering, can you talk to us a little bit about the research process for the actual book? I mean, were there any surprising discoveries along the way? And, you know,
yeah, there were a lot of surprises. One of the things that I think was important, at least for me, is I decided that given the time, that I needed to talk to the oldest people first. And I did, and I'm glad that I did, because in the process, I think about 5 or 6 people died after I had done the interviews with them. Now, the interviews didn't kill them, but they were older and they passed. The second thing is, I was just surprised at some people who were frank in saying, yes, this happened and that happened. I didn't expect that level of honesty in some people, and there were a few who continued to articulate the same sort of positions that they held all along. But yeah, part of it is interviewing people. Part of it is going into the Library of Congress, which had a fair amount of material. Going into the archives in Kew Gardens in London, and reading a lot of newspapers. There was a lot of newspaper coverage, and I have a collection of Caribbean contact that I've had from about 1980 that turned out to be very useful in addressing some of these issues. But a lot of the records are there, and a lot of people observe them. In fact, as I recall, David de Caries had published a whole set of the archival information in the Stabroek News, and so yeah, a lot of it is available, and some of it is not, but a lot of it is available.
Okay. Well, I have a gentleman called John Alyung. I don't know how I'm pronouncing your surname, but he says he's got several questions, and I'm going to ask him if you can just unmute yourself, but ask just one question, please, and then I'll come back to you. Yes.
First, thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask this. I will only ask one question. First, I want to thank Professor Linden for his excellent historical research, which I lived through most of it. And there have been items that have been reported in the newspapers, etc. But I'm wondering, with his research, has he found any new findings? And I'm just going to mention some topics, but then I'm going to zero in on one of them, which is most important. Some of the topics can be Burnham financial involvement in the Jonestown, Walter Rodney.
In what? Could you repeat?
Jonestown.
On Jonestown.
Yes, Walter Rodney involved, and Burnham involvement. But I'm not going to go into those details, or even the death of Burnham. There are questions there. But what I want to ask, my main question is the Port of Spain Protocol. Why was the Port of Spain Protocol not renewed? Because it has implications today.
Yeah,
You know what?
Yeah, go ahead.
Should I explain what the Port of Spain Protocol is?
Are you talking about where there was an assessment of the three parties by the Eric Williams government?
No, the Port of Spain Protocol was written in, hold on, give me a second just now. There's so many questions I have based on what I remember going on, because I work with Eric Williams also. And in June 18, 1970, Burnham signed the Port of Spain Protocol with Venezuela. The protocol, in place for 12 years, promoted cooperation between the two countries in the border dispute in the Guyana Essequibo region. It was not renewed, and I'm curious if you came up with that and why it was not renewed, because if it were, we would not be having these problems today in Guyana with Venezuela.
Well, I think you would have problems with Venezuela anyway.
No, but
thank you, John. I'm just going to put you back on mute to allow Linden to answer the question. Thank you.
Yeah, there was that protocol, but remember that the incursions from Venezuela have been happening for years, and we know of various attempts to include or to appropriate parts of Guyana. So I don't know if that protocol in particular would have prevented what is happening today. I mean, even Maduro, sorry, not Maduro, excuse me, I'm blanking on the
Chavez.
previous, Chavez, yeah, Chavez. Even he had some interest in renewing this discussion about Venezuela. So that is a long-standing problem, and I don't know that anyone. I mean, even the current thing is we don't know how much that is going to hold. I've forgotten the first two parts. The first part was something about if I found something about Burnham. Oh, and Burnham and Jonestown. I go into more detail in the book about, not necessarily about Burnham, but about the relationship between the government and the and Jonestown Temple movement. And there were a lot of sort of things that were irregularities that that we have to take into consideration. One of the things, for example, that Gordon Lewis talks about is that there's no way that Jonestown could have happened in most of the other English-speaking Caribbean countries. For one, it was a question of size, whether there was enough size for there to be the relocation of 918 people into another place. And one of the people that he pointed out was Eric Williams, and he was saying there's no way that Jonestown could have happened in Trinidad, because Eric Williams was too skeptical an individual to allow a set of strangers into his country. He was skeptical of his own people, the people around him in government, and there was no way that he was going to allow a set of foreigners to come in and occupy this country. But there was a certain, if you like, an affinity between Burnham and Jones. Remember when Jones left Indiana, he had all kinds of radical ideas. I mean, at one time he even thought that he might have been a Leninist, right? And he was attracted to Burnham's socialism and what he was doing there. So there was a sort of affinity between the two people. My computer is saying something here to me, and I'm not sure why it is. Okay. Oh, I think it is this one. Okay. Let me just get this organized. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I don't remember the first part. I know that the first question had something to do. Oh, I think the first question is about Rodney and the Same People's Temple, right? And I cut out, even though I know I went longer than I should, I cut out the section of what Rodney said in a lecture in California about Jonestown. And one of the things he was saying is that you have to place the blame on what happened in Port Kaituma on both the US government and on the Guyana government. And in that regard, he said, if you look at the report, you'll see that both of them failed to come to the rescue. The other thing is that, and Rodney made a sort of passing comment, which was a sarcastic comment. He says, Burnham was behaving as though 918 people die in the bush every day in Guyana, right? And at one point, there's two things, just two quick things. One is, I remember I was in Barbados at the time of the Jonestown massacre. And one of the things that was reported in the Caribbean news and especially in Caribbean Contact was that a lot of the information on Jonestown was not coming out of the news houses in Guyana, but people were getting this information from international news or from relatives in the diaspora. And that is interesting in itself. So there's a lot that could be said about Burnham and his relationship. I don't know that Burnham had a direct relationship in Jonestown, but the interests of Jim Jones and Burnham seemed to be compatible in the sense that Burnham was interested in hinterland development. It was difficult to get the GDF people to go up into Port Kaituma, and here was a man who made a new city in Port Kaituma, cleared the way, and a number of us said at the time he built a state within the state. I hope I've covered all the questions that you asked.
Thank you. Thank you for that. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go through the questions that are in the chat. I just wanted to say, Alif, I'm acknowledging you. I can see you have your hand raised. So once I've gone through the questions, I'll come through to you. There's a comment from Paul Nero, Tennessee, who he's basically saying, can he have your contact detail? Basically, Paul, if you can give me your contact details, I can then pass them on to Linden so he can get in touch with you. Yeah, but apparently he wants to do an interview with you for Carib Nation TV. So that's exciting. And then the question comes from Margaret Jill, and she just says, Professor Linden, thank you so much for the talk. I look forward to reading the book. The question is, does Earl Lovelace's position on whites that he was not, that he will not allow them to be demons demonized because it then exempts them from responsibility for their humanity, a bit of what you're saying here about Burnham? Not quite sure what that's referring to. Does that make any sense to you?
Juanita, I didn't get what I'm saying about, about something white.
There should be something that says chat.
It says,
Can I speak?
Yes, please do. Yes.
Yes. Yes, Professor.
Hi, Margaret.
Yeah, hi. What I was saying is that Earl Lovelace had a position on white people in SALT, that he will not allow them to be demons. He will not allow them to be, he will not demonize them, because what that then does is exempt them from responsibility for their own humanity. And I was asking if you were saying a similar thing about Burnham, with a follow-up of if you're saying that we can't afford to demonize him, we have to follow carefully and see what he really is. The follow-up is, and after this knowledge, what forgiveness? It's a question that was asked by T.S. Eliot. I'm doing these literature things because I went to the first 1972 Carifesta in Guyana. And a poet.
Yeah. Margaret Lovelace is one of my favorite people, but I never got around to reading Salt. I will. But it isn't a question of not, it's not a question of not demonizing him. I think where criticism is necessary, we need to do that, right? And where it is not, we don't need to make up a story about it. So I'm not in the business of demonizing anybody. I say, let's all examine our faults, our mistakes, our missteps, and attempt to address them. I think to talk about demonizing is to place what you're doing in a particular light that biases your analysis from Jump Street. And forgiveness, forgiveness, forgiveness is also a part of that rewriting of the history. Either you place it in its proper context, at which point people can read and make a decision for themselves, or you leave it as it is. But I don't know exactly what you mean by forgiveness. But I don't know how we forgive people who are dead for things that they've done.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I don't think when we're looking at history with detachment, it's not about any, it's just looking at what happened and thinking critically about it. But I agree with you on that. I'm not sure forgiveness comes into it, but I wanted to ask you, there's a question as well that came in from someone called Anne. And she says, based on your extensive work, what would you say are the top 3 insights that emerge for research, scholarship ideas that enhance, inform, and help shape tomorrow's Guyana?
You sure that's directed at me?
Yeah, I know. It's not that it's not a small question. That's a massive question right there for you. But yeah, I guess in a nutshell, in terms of as a researcher and someone involved in scholarship, what maybe have you learned from the research you've done on this that would help us to think about how we shape tomorrow's Guyana?
I think we could learn from our mistakes. I think that we should keep this question of democracy in the forefront and not allow it to be a casualty of remaining in office. I think that's an important thing. I think that democracy, even today we get questions about this issue of democracy, and I think that is an important political objective to maintain. And I think that there are other things that we can I think that is important to establish that sort of contact with the global South, the rest of the global South. It would seem to me as though, perhaps not at this very moment, but that we need to have stronger ties with Latin America. It just makes sense. They're our neighbors, and I think that we need to be associated with them. At the moment, I say it's kind of problematic. I wouldn't advise a strong relationship with Argentina at this point. But I also think that an assessment of cooperation among the CARICOM area is also an important one. That we should have this connection to CARICOM. Not only, I think that since the failure of the Federation, most people in the Caribbean, or not most people, but most governments in the Caribbean have been reluctant to talk about any sort of regional unity or regional cooperation. So we tend to play off the economic from the political, and we want to have this economic integration, but without a political integration. And I think that maybe it's a time that we start to look back at it. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think that political unity, in addition to economic unity, will solve all the problems of the Caribbean. They will not. But at least we have a slightly stronger bargaining power than we currently have, rather than each person going at it alone.
This talking about democracy is reminding me of a question that Nigel had brought up, and you know, when you were talking earlier, you were talking about the formation of the capitalist state as being, I think, conducive to the emergence of authoritarian leaders such as Burnham, and so Nigel posed, he had sort of said, considering the current global uptake in authoritarian trends from Modi in India, also El Salvador, and people like Assad, you know, how does this framework apply to these contemporary leaders? He also says, is authoritarianism in essence an inevitable outcome of the post-colonial state, or even states like the US, given the current situation there?
I know that Nigel would definitely do that to me. I think, but one of the things that I was getting at there is my only objection, I would say, to C.Y. Thomas's book on the rise of the authoritarian state, which is a wonderful book, and I have tremendous respect for C.Y. So if you're listening, C.Y., this is not a criticism of you, but there's a comment in which he says that the state, that it is a rise, that there's a rising of the authoritarian state. I say the state itself is authoritarian. It doesn't have to do anything. It doesn't have to get the boiling point that it becomes authoritarian. It is authoritarian. And that facilitates the usurpation by an authoritarian leader. I think that we are currently in a situation in which there is an attraction to authoritarianism. We're seeing it in the United States and in other parts. There's a feeling that somehow the world has gone awry, and that only a strong man could pull it back together. And this is the fundamental flaw in how we think about things. And I think that the sooner we figure out that you don't need one particular strong man to do it, that you need to have a focus on what you think is a genuine democracy where people's rights are respected and their interests are served by the people who are in office, that we're going to be constantly looking for this thing. So right now we're in a swing where, you know, there was a movement like that in France, then in Italy, then in Spain. It's now in Latin America. It's a troubling tendency, and what we as a people have to do is to be vigilant. We just have to be vigilant and call it out and condemn it wherever it is, and not be complicit with it, and not think that, oh, you know, one of the things that I'll just say this and stop talking. Two of my colleagues on two different occasions talked about how decisive leadership is, and how in one case he was talking about Burnham, in the other case the colleague was talking about other kinds of leaders in the Caribbean, that they made snap decisions. Something needed to be done. You need a strong leader to make that decision, and it isn't always that. Perhaps if you reflected a bit more, it could be done differently. And it doesn't have to be decisive and quick and show this ability to make the snap decision and have things done. When you make the snap decision, sometimes you don't think about it. And you just do what is in the interest of yourself or your party or just staying in power. And that's not working for everybody.
So thank you. I wanted to bring in another question that's in the chat from Roxanne Branca. And she says, good morning all. Congrats to Linden on the book. I had been looking forward to it. I agree with Juanita that Linden was brave because everything which surrounds the story, because of everything that surrounds the story of LFS. Her question is, she says that you'd mentioned something about Burnham's, feed, clothe, and house as something that had been a complete failure. And she just wants to know, is that fair to say? She says, I was in my early teens when that concept was introduced, but it remains with me to this day. Wouldn't you, Linden, say that the feed aspect was somewhat of a success? Until today, with Guyanese in and out of Guyana, Guyanese in and out of Guyana still follow the concept of feeding ourselves. Guyanese, wherever they live, have backyard gardens. People in the interior, especially, are very successful with growing their own food. Wouldn't you say that was part of the success of the Burnham concept?
Juanita, I just want to add that Auntie Joyce Trotman agrees with that it was a success. She was quite passionate about it in the phone call a moment ago.
Okay, so, thanks, Rod.
I know that question has remained with Roxanne because we have discussed it before. Anyway, look, the people around Burnham have talked about his failure, and I think that Ismail Odin has actually documented the failure of it, the failure to produce the houses, the failure to produce the food. I don't, you shouldn't confuse, I don't think that you should confuse the encouragement to grow gardens and to substitute foreign items for local ones. That's not the thing. The thing is whether you were able to produce the kind of food supply to satisfy the Guyanese public, right? And Ismail Ordine, and this is online, has gone through each particular phase: feed, clothe, and house the population, and it has come up short. And I might add that there were people in the inner circle of Burnham who said very clearly to me that one person, and I was surprised to hear this, said they were all gimmicks. I don't believe that, actually. But condemned all three of those things, which in my book, and which I think Roxanne might object to, is not the original thinking of Burnham to feed, clothe, and house the nation. I just put that out there. It didn't come from Burnham, contrary to what people believe. Anyway, but that's a different matter.
So the next question in the chat comes from Michael Mitchell, and he said, thank you so much for a fascinating talk. You mentioned the emigration during Burnham's time. Would it be going too far to say that his greatest legacy, the prominence of the Guyanese diaspora in the US and UK? Michael, do you want to pop on and just clarify that question? I'm not sure I quite...
Sorry, there's an is missing. His greatest legacy is the prominence of the Guyanese diaspora in the US and the UK. Thank you.
That's an interesting question. I can't imagine that you would like your legacy to be that the people have migrated to another shore and that they're vibrant in this other place. So I'm not sure that would be a legacy, unless you're seeing it as a negative in the way that that George Lamming saw it, as the movement of people out of Guyana because things were too difficult for them.
Thanks. No, good point. So there's a question from, I believe it's a friend, Headley. See, Headley, can Professor Lewis expand a little on Burnham and Guyana's support for the African liberation struggle, especially during the apartheid period in South Africa?
Yeah, thanks, Claude. I think that you can't, one of the things that you just can't criticize him on is his support for African liberation. That was there, it was out front and center, and he was unwavering on it. Not only did he support it philosophically, in terms of the support that he gave to Angola and Mozambique and South Africa, but he supported it in terms of actually taking over from the Errol Barrow permitting of the flights can get directly from Cuba to Angola, right? And so they had to make a stop, and the original stop was in Barbados, and so Errol Barrow was allowing them to refuel in Barbados before moving on. But apparently there was some pressure from the State Department on Errol Barrow to stop this refueling of planes in what was then Sewell Airport at the time in Barbados. And so Burnham Burnham then took up the slack, right, and allowed planes to refuel there, and that happened until he too got into a lot of pressure. But the other thing is the runway at Atkinson Airport was not long enough for the planes and so on. So that wasn't going to go very far. But one of the things that we don't talk about, and I don't have enough evidence for it, but I've seen UC Guyana talk about it, and a friend of mine talked about seeing a number of GDF people who went to Angola. So there were boots on the ground, right? So he didn't just talk the talk, but he walked the walk on that one. And then the other one is that he had a very hard line on people in sport, especially people in cricket, going to South Africa. So there's a big conflict between Barbados and Guyana, because remember, Errol Barrow and Forbes Burnham were very close friends. And at one point, so Garfield Sobers went to Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and had lunch with the head of state and so on, and talked fairly favorably about having lunch with Ian Smith. And Burnham said, no, you can't come back, right? We have a ban on people going to South Africa, and you chose to do that. You know, a lot of Caribbean people, and Jimmy Cliff went to South Africa twice. I don't know he ever wanted to go to Guyana, but if at the time, he would not have been allowed in Guyana because that was the rule. And by the way, I think Alvin Kalituran got ensnared by that whole thing as well. But he viewed it in other terms, which we don't have to get into. So yeah, he had a very strong, you see, Burnham also saw himself as a sort of Pan-Africanist. You know, he was part of the non-aligned movement, and he saw himself really as a Pan-Africanist as well. So his contact with his association with South Africa and Africa in general was very positive. There was no doubt about that.
Thank you for that expansion on the question there. I wanted to bring us back to the comment about emigration from Guyana, because there's a comment in the chat where somebody was saying that they worked as a senior economist in the Burnham government between 1975 and 80. And during that time, the civil service was staffed by some well-qualified and competent personnel. But unfortunately, we were unable to do our job due to political interference, in quotes, paramountcy of the party. And as a result, we left the country. So I just, wanted to share that. Then going back to what Margaret was talking about in terms of forgiveness, and I'd said sort of something about history being this kind of more detached look at it. And she's saying, but it is not a detached look at history if Burnham killed your husband and father and comrade. And she just mentions that there is a Rodney restitution organization as we speak. The other comment comes from Joyce Trotman. And she's reflecting on, as Rod said, on something that Roxanne mentioned about feed, house, and clothe. She said she had a close relationship with one of the civil servants, Sybil Patterson, and Henry Cameron, who were civil servants. And she said it was a matter of encouraging self-help. The concern was with building some of the houses at the back of Lodge. All had to do their best and know what you would, I'm not quite sure what you would do to get a house. Maybe people came from other Caribbean islands to see how it was done. So yes, I think she's suggesting there were some successes in terms of that. My phone is ringing up. I'll ignore that. That's not for this. And then Alison Tyndall's got a direct question. She says, what is your assessment of the impact of the institution of the national service on Guyana's economic development and national identity?
Oh, okay. The first part, I as I said to Roxanne, I don't think that we are critical of encouraging people to help themselves, to become more efficient, to be producers and all that. That's part of the process. It's not the entire process. And that's about feeding yourself. It's not about the government providing the resources to make that happen, right? The other part about the civil service and so I think that that's true, that that there's a part of that is a part of dealing with the question of the civil service and how the civil service. But listen, we all know that governments in the Caribbean from time to time can make life difficult for people in the civil service. You know, you can move a person to the country where they're not in the best resource place. So you can have that manipulation going on. But I think that in terms, I think if you look at what Ishmael Odin talks about, you can see that the target number of houses to be built fell really short of it. Right, and that's why I'm saying that was a problem. So I don't know. I think if you just, you know, I remember that there's a part of Burnham's thing where he says feed, house, and clothes is a good mnemonic, but that we need to embody that. And I think that when you begin to look at it objectively, I don't know that you could come out that these things were that highly successful. I really don't. There was a third question. I can't
Yes, it was from Alison Tyndall. She says, what is your assessment of the impact of the institution of national service on Guyana's economic development and national identity?
That also has this controversy. It was a problematic sort of program. Look, I think that in general, there's nothing wrong with people putting back into the society a certain amount of time as a result of the education that they've received. So the national service was there, but it was it was a program that was plagued by a number of issues, and you know, there's a whole set of stuff that Janet Jagan talked about, the national service, but it's I don't know. I think that some of it is useful in the sense that you build some skills in individuals. You get them to serve the society that they've benefited from, like people who go to UG and so on. But I don't know about the rest of it, about whether the rest of it falls in place in the way in which I think it was imagined. And it tended to be more controversial than anything else.
Mm. So just to say, it's now in the UK, it's 5:17, and I plan to wrap up by 5:30. So I've just got one more question I'm going to pose from the chat, and then I'm going to come to Aleph. I think now, let me just check what the question was in the chat. Just saying, picking up on what Rohanna was saying about Papa Doc, just to say what Rohanna saw as being in common was presidency for life and whalers at the funeral. So I'll leave that. There was another question, but I'm gonna let's see. Colin Babb says, what is the best? Oh, okay, this is a good question. Everybody needs to know this. What is the best way to obtain the book for everybody who's based here in the UK?
Can we have more of those questions?
Yes. Colin, I got mine via Amazon, just to say. So, but yeah. So
did the callers say in the US or UK?
In the UK. So I think in the UK, the only way I saw to get it was in Amazon. So if you know of any other avenues, then
no, I don't. I only know through Amazon.
And in the US?
Amazon or through Rutgers University.
Oh, Rutgers University.
You can go directly to Rutgers University Press and get a copy, or you could go to Amazon. I think it is. I don't hold me to this, but I think it's slightly less expensive from the press directly. But I'm not 100% sure on that.
Okay. There's a couple of questions I'm not going to be able to get to in the chat because of time, but there is something that is in the chat that I think should be addressed, and that's about Bruce Nobrega brought up the issue of Cara Festa. And he says, surely, basically, that Burnham, part of his legacy, when you're talking about that, must address his influence on the region, Carifta and Cara Festa, etc. So I don't know what you're smiling. So let's hear.
I'm smiling because I'm curious about how Guyanese respond to this one. This is the one that they might throw eggs at me. Look. I have had long talks with George Lamming, who knew Burnham. I mean, I had some pictures of Lamming and Martin Carter meeting Burnham and Cheddi. The story that I have in the book is that CLR James was receiving Eric Williams at his house in London. And CLR James called Lamming and said, Eric is going to be over here. He wants to talk about a way of acknowledging the contribution of Trinidadian writers. And he wanted to give the nation a gift of bringing home these writers. So Lamming goes over to CLR James's place. Eric Williams is there, they discuss it, and that was that. He says Eric goes back to Trinidad, and they're there, and they never hear from Eric Williams again. Fast forward, and Lamming is in Guyana, and he's meeting with Forbes, and he says he's telling Forbes about this encounter that he had with Eric Williams, and they had this discussion, and he says one of the things about Forbes is that he's an extremely good listener. He said he may not look as though he's listening when you're talking, but he's paying very close attention to what you're saying. And he said he just mentions this thing about bringing the writers to Trinidad that Eric had suggested. And he says in the next couple of months, Guyana is sending out things to all the writers and artists saying that he's going to have this thing in Guyana. And this emerges into CARIFESTA in 1972. Now, I don't know. I think if you're a Burnham loyalist, you probably would think differently. So, but all I'm saying is that when it comes to that question of the legacy, I don't think that you should ignore another interpretation of what happened. Now, having said that, I don't think anybody could question the regionalism of Forbes Burnham. I think he was an ardent regionalist, and he was also a very important patron of the arts. Could he have come up with it on his own? Quite possible. He was a very brilliant man. But I'm just saying that when you talk about a legacy and you see CARIFESTA, the only thing that we can say outside of the knowledge of what I just talked about is that he made it happen, and it is still going on today. It's not a perfect thing. There's a quote that I have in there by Derek Walcott, in which he says, you know, most of the year nobody pays any attention to us, but then at some point, all the artists become important in CARIFESTA, right? That's a sort of cynical look at it. But I think that if you're going to talk about about CARIFESTA, I think it's something that you need to pay attention to as one of the things that he may have heard somewhere else.
Okay. Roxanne, of course, came back saying, what are you saying, that Burnham should not get credit for CARIFESTA? I would think we're going to have to leave that for an offline conversation because it's now 5:25. But thank you for the question, Roxanne. Alif, I wanted you to come in with the final question so we can round up. I'd ask you to try and be as concise as possible. Thank you. You'll need to unmute yourself though, Alif. Alif is our resident nonagenarian.
Resident, I campaigned for Burnham, so that's how resident I am. I campaigned before I could vote. Now, I thank you for the book and all that, but Burnham was the first in the colonial change, and he demonstrated great strength and great weakness. I don't think you mentioned the racial, ethnic divide that continues to drown in Guyana politics. And I don't really think you mentioned that the success of this man was because he was first. He had nothing to go on. And while the nationalism was great, they had no national expertise to carry on the processes in Guyana because it was not given to the ordinary people. All expertise came from England. So that's where Guyana continues to fail. I thank you for listening. I thank you.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you so much. Did you want to come back on that at all?
Well, I don't know. I don't know what she meant by the first. There are people in other parts of the Caribbean who existed before Burnham. But if you go all the way back to Toussaint, the people
in Guyana. I'm talking about in Guyana itself. In Guyana.
You can't say that, then you would erase all of what Chedi Jagan did.
Because the ethnicity was different in each island, in each surrounding. Ethnicity was slightly different, very different in Guyana as it was in Jamaica, as it was in a lot of the islands, because we have 6 clear ethnicities in Guyana, and they were fighting between each other. More.
Alif, are you saying it was more complicated in the Guyanese context?
Far
right,
more.
okay.
Far more. Sorry.
Thank you.
I think that to disagree with you a bit, Alif,
Herwood.
I did mention that one of the problems that you had in Guyana is this colonially generated dissension that occurred between Indians and people of African descent. And that always clouds everything. That's clouding everything today, right? It is one of those things that the colonial people injected and continued to propagate, right? And one of the things that was so special about Walter Rodney is that for the first time, you had a sort of political mobilization that went beyond that, right? And so that was uncomfortable not only for Burnham, but that was uncomfortable for Jaden, right? Remember that there was no big embrace of the WPA and of Walter Rodney by the PPP either, right? So yeah, but if it isn't the African Indian thing is in Guyana or in Trinidad, there's some other kind of conflict that there are always classes and class fractions and groups that get involved in the political process, and you have to be able to navigate yourself around them.
It always seemed to me that the greatest sin, if you like, was the killing of Walter Rodney because of the multi-ethnic possibilities of Walter's own legacy. Had he lived for much longer, Guyana might be a very different place today. I mean, I don't know, whether that's a romanticization of the situation or reality, but yes. So we're at 5:29. So I think probably a good time to stop and to say thank you very much for your time and your insights. Absolutely fantastic talk today. So really appreciate it. And I'm sure everybody would join me in giving you a virtual applause. Yeah, thank you so much. And just to remind everybody, yes, this is the book. I have to say, Rod and we started reading it. Time hasn't allowed us to get very far because we only got it a couple of weeks ago, but you write absolutely beautifully. And what I love about it is that the way you write pulls the reader along. So if you're someone who doesn't normally like reading, you want to read this, I would highly recommend it because it is written very beautifully, and you will find it a compelling read. So yeah, I'd highly recommend it. But yes, last thank you. I'm going to switch the recording off. I think let me just get that out the way. Start recording. Here we go.